And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is the 25th episode in our journey through the scripture series. We highly encourage you to go back and review the other episodes along with our special episodes that we've done over the last several months, going all the way back to last October. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis for our podcast name, and provide some helpful resources that'll hopefully help you grow in your own journey. From time to time, Kit and I also respond to direct questions listeners pose that fit our current topic. You can reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. That's contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit that bell for notifications so you're always notified when fresh content drops. We do drop a new episode every Monday, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride with us as we journey through the scriptures. During our last episode, we actually really hit the fast forward button quite a bit, and you can speak to this in just a little bit too. But a few quick things that I wanted to stamp is that while we did make quite a bit of progress, and we've obviously fast forwarded to now having folks that are sitting on the edge of the promised land, it's important to understand too is that much about Israel's heart has not changed. And in fact, one of the reasons too that we stamped that so much during our last episode is we know, given how people engage and understand the idea of religion, that they often equate progress or just even our own ideals with virtue. And the fact that when we see growth in ourselves, or that when we feel we have closer attainment to God, we feel that is due to our own righteousness. And that is not the case. And that certainly is not the case here in our biblical story. And so we'll unpack that a little bit more as we engage with the books of Joshua and Judges. As we jump into our study this week, our first question is, Kit, discuss a little bit how the book of Joshua is both triumphal and cautionary, highlighting Israel's celebratory conquest of the land while also warning about the dire dangers that loomed in the nation's future.
Well, most of the book of Joshua is the account of Israel taking the land, and it happened in a gradual process. God said, if I give it to you all at once, you won't be able to hold it, you won't be able to manage it. So we're going to do this in a kind of sequential, slow process. But you have the book of Joshua recording that progressive taking of the land and distributing different inheritances, land inheritances to the 12 tribes, essentially setting up Israel's presence in the land and the tribal inheritances and all of that. But it ends with an exhortation, a kind of sermon, if you will, or exhortation and encouragement by Joshua to the sons of Israel. And this very much parallels what Moses had done with them in the book of Deuteronomy at the end. And this idea of both triumphal and cautionary, well, Israel has gained the land, and Joshua even says to them, all of the Lord's good promises he has fulfilled. Not one of them has failed. He has done what he said he was going to do, but, and then here's the caveat, and this is actually in Joshua 24, he says, now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. This is all the way back to Abraham's heritage and then their time in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, and this is Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel, the God who's made himself known to you through this covenant relationship and his own faithfulness towards you, then choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. But as for me, Joshua says, and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake Yahweh to serve other gods. For Yahweh, our God, he's the one who brought us and our fathers out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and who did all these great signs in our midst and has preserved us through all the way in which we went and among all the peoples through whose midst we passed. All these 40 years. And Joshua says to the people, you will not be able to serve Yahweh. For he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. And then the people say, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua says, well, you're witnesses then against yourselves that you have chosen for yourselves Yahweh. And they said, we are witnesses. And so that binding themselves to Yahweh is once again their stated commitment, but it's going to continue to fall short. And so there is this warning that comes out from Joshua as well, that if you prove unfaithful, this is not going to go well for you. And eventually what's going to happen, and certainly this is what Moses spoke of, is God's going to drive you from this land. And it's going to become desolate and a waste, and you will be scattered among the nations. You will be exiled and in bondage.
Yes, indeed. At the time of Moses' death, the Lord directed that his mantle be transferred to Joshua. What is the significance of Joshua recapitulating or retelling with more purpose and intensity his predecessor's methods and message?
Well, I think the scripture makes it clear that Joshua is the new Moses. Moses was the one who the people had asked to stand between them and God. That happened at Sinai, and God had said, the people have spoken well. It is good that you will stand between me and the people of Israel. And that mantle, that responsibility, that role was transferred to Joshua. And the text makes it clear in several ways, but certainly, as I said, through just the fact that, and as you hint at here in the questions, that Joshua is dealing with the people as their mediator in the same way that Moses did. He is the one who is rehearsing with them the faithfulness of their God and reminding them that he's proven faithful, he's kept his covenant, he's done what he said. And yet, on the other hand, he's also warning them about their own history, forcing them to look back and see their own unfaithfulness, and warning them that if indeed they will not be faithful going forward, it will not go well for them. Like Moses, in effect, he's saying, I put in front of you life and death, choose life. And that has to do with, again, continuing with God in his covenant land, in his dwelling place, life being associated with relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's doing the same sort of thing as Moses had done. And it's both a prophetic function, it's both a priestly function. And we'll see the same sort of role played by others in Israel's history, certainly their prophets.
Israel's rejecting Yahweh's lordship in favor of each man living as his own king is a prominent motif in the book of Judges, but it is reflected in a disposition that that existed before the people even left Egypt. How is this the case? And consider the significance of Israel's covenant corruption and waywardness, thrusting them into a national repeated cycle defined by rest, complacency, apostasy, subjugation, repentance, deliverance, and restoration. I know there's a lot there, kid, so feel free to kind of dissect that and break that into smaller parts. But at the end of the day, help us not only understand that cycle, but also what it reflects about the fact that that cycle is vicious and it's perpetual and they can't seem to get out of that. What does it actually reveal about Israel's heart at the end of the day?
Right. Well, this is focusing on the book of Judges. And if the listeners are familiar with that book, this is after Joshua. This is after the people are settled in the land and moving forward. But once again, the warnings that had been issued to them tied to whether they would prove faithful to Yahweh or not, those warnings are now beginning to find them out, be realized in their experience. And so kind of this highlight theme of the book of Judges you see it repeated twice, is this idea, now in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, each man is his own God. Now, these are the sons of Israel. And you say, okay, well, it's true. There was no king in Israel. This is before the monarchy. This is before the first king Saul. Well, the truth is Yahweh was king in Israel and had all from the beginning he was to be king in Israel. No matter who the human rulers or agencies were, they were administering God's rule. Yahweh's king in Israel. And so this is kind of a stinging indictment of the fact that the people have rejected Yahweh's lordship. They've rejected him as king, and they're effectively functioning as their own king, which takes us all the way back to Genesis 3. So these echoes are here. We're back at the same fundamental problem again. And the way this plays out in Israel's history at this point in time in Judges, there is no human king, there is no monarchy in Israel, and God is administering his kingship through judges, through these men who are judges. But the judges function as kind of points of demarcation in this progressive history that you mentioned. What you see in Judges is a series of cycles, each one associated with a certain judge. And what happens is, again, the people are in the land, they're at rest, just as God has said, when you enter the land and it's comfortable and it's easy and you're all settled in, then your hearts are going to begin to wander from me. And that's what's happening. So this rest turns into a complacency, and that complacency then yields to a kind of waywardness and beginning to look away from God and losing the intensity of the relationship and becoming distracted, beginning to follow other gods. And that kind of waywardness just increases to a greater level of corruption until God begins to bring enemies against them in the land. They're not being expelled from the land at this point, but Canaanite powers are coming against them and oppressing them and afflicting them. And so it's a kind of bondage and subjugation in the land that causes them to cry out to God, and he sends them a judge who is a deliverer. And that judge comes and liberates them from this bondage, from this oppression by powers inside of the land of Canaan. And the cycle starts over again. The judge gives them rest. And then perhaps through the life of the judge, things go pretty well. Then the judge dies and the people are aimless again and complacent. And we move into the same cycle of waywardness and idolatry and falling away. And they cry out to God because more oppression comes, more affliction. And then once again, he raises a judge. So this cycle happens over and over again. And it becomes a kind of repeating of even this idea of the captivity in Egypt and God delivering them to bring them back to himself. They're not leaving the land, but it shows that exile is really a relational thing. Captivity is a relational thing. It's not a physical thing. They're in the land, but God is giving them over and they come into a state of bondage. So that's what's happening in the book of Judges. And it's all centered in this idea of each man as his own king. And perhaps the high point in the book of Judges is this kind of strange event that happens in chapter 19 with the Ephraimite, the man, the Levite, who is with his concubine traveling and passes by Jerusalem and says, well, we're not going to stay there. These are foreigners. This was well before Jerusalem had been conquered. We're going to go and we're going to stay with our kinsmen. So they come into a city of Benjamin, I think it was Gibeah, and they stay there for the night. Well, you have these men come out and they say, hey, and it becomes a repeat of the Sodom and Gomorrah episode that we saw in Genesis, I think chapter 19.
Right.
And they want to come in and break into the house and they get at this man, and so he ends up throwing his concubine out the door to him, and they rape her and kill her. These men of a city of Benjamin, these are Israelites, and he ends up cutting her into pieces and sending her the parts of her body to the 12 tribes of Israel. And this creates a war in Israel where all of the other tribes go to war against Benjamin. But the point of all of that is to show that Israel has become indistinguishable from the nations. In Israel's history, if you wanted to put a title on how bad the world was out there in its alienation from God, it would be the ideas of Sodom and Gomorrah. That represents the height of human debauchery
Right.
and idolatry and alienation from God. And now what is being depicted here is that Israel has become that bad. Even though they're in the land, even though they're God's people, they have become that bad. And this is picked up in Isaiah's prophecy, where God indicts them at the very beginning of Isaiah and says, you are sons, I've reared sons, but you're unfaithful. An ox knows its owner, a donkey knows its own manger, its own habitation, but you don't know me. And he refers to them as the rulers of Sodom, the people of Gomorrah. Your sacrifices are odious to me. Don't bring them to me. So Israel's become really no different than Sodom and Gomorrah. And that same language will be ultimately used of Jerusalem, when it rejects the Messiah. So anyway, but that's what's happening in Judges, is that everything that Moses had warned about, everything that Joshua had warned about has happened. The people who were to be distinct from the world have become indistinguishable from the rest of the world. And that leads into this time of, again, the climactic thing of calling for a king. And I think that's kind of where we end up in our next questions. But
Yeah, and like I love how you serve that up, kid, and just even stamping just for our audience, the idea that resonated with me is that exile, even though it does have geographical significance and obviously physical ramifications, but at its core, it is a relational concept, right? And it is
right.
relationally expressed, and it's helpful for us to understand that, especially as we go into our next question. The nation's failed sonship expressed itself in failed mission. How is this assertion not only reaffirmed in the book of Judges, but amplified in the writer's statement that each man did what was right in his own eyes? And you've already spoken to this a little bit, but maybe kind of even go a step, maybe like a layer deeper there, Kit.
Well, once again, Israel was the Abrahamic people. Israel was Yahweh's elect son for the sake of the nations. That's what Israel was by covenant and by covenant election. And so the way in which Israel would mediate God's blessing to all the families of the earth was by living a life of faithful sonship. As we've talked so much, biblically, a son is of the father. And when a son faithfully conforms to his sonship, he is a revealer of the Father. And in the ancient world, that was very common. Often a father's estate, or if he was a ruler or a king, he administered and actually manifested his rule, his kingship, through a son or through his sons. And so a son was the way in which the father was, in a sense, reflected into the world and operative in the world. And Israel was to be that. But Israel now, as I said, even with this idea of the rape of the concubine and her murder and being cut into pieces, the people of Israel have become indistinguishable from Sodom and Gomorrah. So this covenant son chosen out of the world to live out a sonship of devotion and faithfulness, uprightness, a son who is to manifest Yahweh to the world, has become indistinguishable from the world in its hubris, its alienation, its unrighteousness. Israel's become like Sodom and Gomorrah. How can they manifest Yahweh to the world that looks like Sodom and Gomorrah when they look just like Sodom and Gomorrah? So that's this idea of failed mission. Israel wasn't just to live in a land and enjoy the fruit of it. This was all about ultimately God's purpose to gather back the human race to himself through this particular people. But they're showing that they can't be the solution or a part of the, God's instrument in the solution, when they're just as much a part of the problem and hopelessly a part of the problem as everybody else in the world is. So this is the kind of the big theme in the Old Testament scriptures, is how will God's purposes for the world be realized when he's bound those purposes up in Abraham and Abraham's descendants, and Abraham's descendants cannot fulfill their role, their responsibility. But the book of Judges puts a very sharp point on that. Israel is just like everybody else. They cannot be God's light to the nations.
Yeah, I think like that takes us well into our last question for the episode, Kit. How does this rampant attitude of rebellion and self-idolatry catalyze the emergent monarchy depicted in First Samuel and Saul as the ideal answer to make them like the other nations, which we already know is their folly and their foolishness? Kit, speak a little bit
Right.
to that and how that actually starts to set us up as we actually start moving towards really exploring what's happening during like that monastic period.
Well, the book of Judges yields to essentially First Samuel, in the chronology of the salvation history. And Samuel is the last of the judges. These judges are men that God raises up as deliverers, as rulers. They're the ones who kind of mediate his relationship with the people of Israel when there is no king in Israel. Well, God had told Moses way back when that the day was going to come when he was going to give them a king, because a kingdom needs a king, and God's own design for the human race is that man will be the point of God's rulership in the world, right? So it was God's intent that Israel eventually have a king, but through Moses, God said he's to be a certain kind of king. He's to be a king who's devoted to me, who's devoted to my Torah, who doesn't multiply horses, who doesn't multiply wives, who doesn't, in a sense, aggrandize himself, but who is administering my rule, my mind, my lordship in the world. Well, now as we come to the end of the period of the judges, Samuel is the last of those judges. And when he's about to die, he anoints his sons to be judges. But the text says that they were unrighteous men, they were self serving men. They took advantage of their power and their authority to receive bribes and to practice injustice, typical of the way rulers in the world operate. They use their power to serve themselves. It's the procedure of the king, as the book of Samuel puts it. So the people say, we're done with these judges. We're done with these kinds of rulers. We want a king. It's time for a king. And as you said, interestingly, they want a king not so much because Samuel's sons are unrighteous, but they want to be like the other nations. And the whole point of the covenant is that they are to be unique among the nations. They are to be God's light into a dark world, but they want to be like the rest of the world. And so, even in the king that they pick, the king that they envision, he's effectively a man after their own heart. And that's this King Saul that they pick. And I think we'll probably go into that more moving forward. But they want a king after their own heart. He's not even really of the regal tribe, and so he cannot really be God's king. But Saul is the one who appears to be everything that a king should be: taller than everybody else, a great warrior, distinguished, very good looking, very handsome, all of the things that people look for in a ruler. They want to be like the nations. And so it's once again just another indication of the fact that Israel is no different than everybody else. And even though they have been chosen by God in Abraham to be this unique, distinct nation for the sake of bringing the rest of the world back to God, they're indistinguishable from all of that. And that's not going to happen with them. It cannot come about. So the transition into the monarchy is very much just the continuation of the idea that Israel will not have Yahweh to be king. Yeah, they finally say, we want to have a king, but it's not to have one who will actually be Yahweh's man ruling in the world, but a king after their own heart, a king that will cause them to be like all the other nations and have that same kind of status and standing, and not be these strange people in the midst of the ancient Near Eastern world.
Indeed, indeed. We sincerely hope this time that you've shared with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. Make sure you hit that bell for notifications. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.